That's an interesting point the Prime Minister made, Chris Alexander. The internet is still a bit of a free-for-all. There has to be some way of proving that crimes can be committed on the internet. The trouble is, of course, we had that internet surveillance bill that's kind of languishing about. Where do you draw the line between sort of intruding on people's privacy and making sure crimes are caught on the internet, like the Rehtaeh Parson's case?
Well, I think this tragic case has reminded us that quite apart from the broader issues of the internet, there are these very, very serious, very, very tragic cases, Rehtaeh Parson's and unfortunately others, that represent crimes committed on the internet. We all agree with that. You heard the three parties agreeing with that, and law enforcement doesn't yet have the tools they need in this era to go after them. So good to see the government committing to continue its action on this front. Good to see the opposition agreeing.
And the justice ministers, I understand, are unanimously suggesting that something has to be done. Randall, are we talking about closing a loophole here, or do you think a new bill has to be done? How far should we go in monitoring?
Well, what I'm hoping is that people will stay on point here. We have a very specific problem that the Rehtaeh Parson's case has raised for all of us to deal with. We have a large degree of unity among all the various parties and the various levels of government, and I'd like to see us move forward on that issue. I hope it doesn't become partisan, and I don't think we can work on that issue if we try to drag every other issue from Parliament into it. So I think we need to stay on point and work on this specific problem.
Staying on point means what? What exactly should be legislated into place to prevent this kind of tragedy from being repeated?
Well, we've had very specific proposals that have been made, I know, to the Prime Minister and to our leader, and I know there'll be talks on those, and they will come forward at some point with that proposal. But if we try to draw all the other bills, all the other possibilities into this, I'm afraid we'll delay things and we'll lose that unity we've got at this point. And out of respect for Rehtaeh Parson's family and out of respect for what happened, we need to stay on that and do something very specific to address that problem.
Francis, your thoughts?
Well, I would think that a lot of legislation needs to be updated just to bring in the language of the internet. I mean, a lot of these bills, you know, we used to talk about wiretapping in terms of phones, but you know, now we're dealing with all kinds of new technologies, and unless, as my understanding is that unless those technologies are specifically mentioned in legislation, the police can't act or you can't prosecute. So I probably it's a case of bringing legislation, the language of legislation, up to date, up to speed.
Do you think, Chris, that they can zero in on this one problem without getting the government getting carried away and trying to legislate beyond dealing with this, so we don't have another internet surveillance bill coming back?
Well, I think it's always been our intention to focus on what our law enforcement agenda continues to focus on, which is victims. And Rehtaeh Parson's is a particularly moving, particularly tragic case.
And Amanda Todd, same thing.
Amanda Todd, and there are others. But we're all moved not just by the need to make sure this doesn't happen again, but by the actions of her family, by the reaction in that community, by the sense of public spiritedness, as the Prime Minister said today, that her parents have shown. That commands our attention on a very specific issue, and we have to make sure it fits into the criminal code. We have to make sure it's consistent for our laws. We pride ourselves on the coherence and the strength of our law enforcement system and its modernity. Let's make these changes in that spirit.
I want to talk a bit about the terrorism developments that are happening in the last 24 hours. I find it interesting the Wall Street Journal is talking about our RCMP moving ahead on these arrests, ahead of what the U.S. authorities wanted the timetable to be. They've still got their own investigation underway. Francis, what do you think's behind that? Why were we in such a rush when the RCMP admitted at the news conference there was no imminent danger of an action being taken?
Well, that's a good question. You know, it's something that will need to be fleshed out. I mean, you know, it's very hard to comment on the conversations that were going on between two security agencies.
And it's sourced.
You know,
it's on the record saying it.
So I mean, it's an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal. I assume the RCMP had good reason to act when it did, but I imagine those reasons will come out in the future. But right now, it's a little hard to get a handle on.
Any thoughts on that, Randall?
Well, I think some people have alleged that there was some political advantage to the government in this arrest coming when it did, and I've argued exactly the opposite, that I think what this arrest shows is there was no need for S7. We were able, when we give resources to our intelligence agencies, to the police, we're able to make progress against terrorism. And so I don't buy the argument that somehow the government would try to bring these forward, because to me it actually breaks their case rather than making it the need for S7.
We're talking to our journalists all the time, and they didn't really see anything wrong if the government said, oh, these arrests are coming, we need to bolster ourselves on fighting terrorism. Let's put this bill on fast track.
The government already used, I guess, the tragic evidence in Boston, because this wasn't on the agenda, this wasn't coming forward till that took place, and then this was scheduled for debate again after being away from the House for weeks. Yeah. So I think if you want to go to that question, there's the broader question. I guess the assumption that the public wouldn't look so closely at S7 in a heightened terror climate.
I want to get Chris in on this. Is this the time to be debating this in the heat of so much confusing action that has so many questions and not a lot of answers?
Yes, it absolutely is, Don. And look at the Rehtaeh Parson's case. We are agreeing to move on those issues because it's at the forefront of the public mind right now. We need to make linkages between the legislative agenda and what is of concern to people in the here and now. Terrorism remains a global concern, but it is an issue in our backyard as well. We don't have to look any further than London, Ontario, or Boston, Massachusetts. The last couple of weeks, these are issues that are unfolding in real time. And yes, our law enforcement has done a spectacular job, but in addition, they need tools to make sure that they really stay ahead of these issues, and not just the capacity to prosecute and investigate when they know something's going on, but the capacity to anticipate. And I wouldn't second-guess the decisions of the RCMP in this case. There was a real case of terrorism that unfolded in Boston. Tragic, loss of life. That changes the outlook for investigators in other cases. And beyond that, we leave, beyond that observation that when an act takes place, everyone looks again at the files that they're involved in. We leave it to them because they are good at their jobs. Our job as legislators is to give them the tools they need to keep Canadians safe.
Is that fair comment? Is this the time to be debating it, Francis? Do you
the bill?
Yes.
Well, it was up for debate. It was coming up for debate anyway. I mean, I didn't necessarily have to be Monday to displace another motion, but it was the time to debate it. The bill is taking its natural course, and probably because of the events, and the bill is getting more public scrutiny than it would have had. I mean, probably a lot of people didn't know it was working its way through the system until this week.
Very difficult to oppose it too, isn't it? You find that, Randall?
No, I don't think so. What we've said is that terrorism is a real threat, but there's also a balance that has to be struck between our very fundamental rights and liberties here. And when the Liberals first introduced these measures in the aftermath of 9/11, they thought they were significantly threatening. They put a sunset clause on. Now they're voting for the bill without a sunset clause. So I'm a bit perplexed about their change of position. But I want to go back to what Chris said about tools, because this is a government that's cut its budget for Canada Border Services Agency, and in particular, they cut 100 intelligence agents out of the Canada Border Service. So if we're going to anticipate and fight terror, and you talk about giving them tools, one of those is the resources they need to do that investigative work.
Quick 20-second rebuttal to you on this.
Well, the NDP's record on this is clear. They don't want the armed forces or law enforcement to have the tools. They've opposed vast investments, necessary investments that we needed to make. No, you want a smaller military, right? Admit it. And you want fewer police. You say it all the time in committee and in this House of Commons.
Well, let's not go off the track here.
No, but I don't want this conversation to end with a disingenuous statement from the opposition. They want smaller law enforcement and military resources for Canada. We know that to keep Canadians safe, we need what we have. It's high quality. By global standards, it's not that big, but we need them, and we need to ensure that those resources continue to evolve to keep Canadians safe.
You did get the last word. I'm sorry about that. We'll get you on the next time, Randall. You can rebut that. Okay. Chris Alexander, Randall Garrison, and Francis Garrett. Thank you for joining us. Okay.